pictures of a Roman soldier because the Roman soldier was a ubiquitous presence. They were everywhere in the first century. The regular civilian would have seen a Roman soldier and would have known exactly what these pieces of armor looked like. So we can look to that as an illustration, but I want you to know that Paul's primary influence when he penned this passage was not a Roman soldier. It may have influenced it in some way, but that was not his primary goal. He wasn't pointing to the Roman soldier. Most of the time we hear in this day and age, we miss the principle. We miss that nuance of it because we don't know what a lot of people in the first century would have known. In the first century, when someone placed faith in Jesus, when a Gentile came into the family of God, they immediately began a very rigorous study of the Old Testament. Can I just tell you that if you are ignoring the Old Testament in your study of the Scriptures, the New Testament is fantastic, study it, but do not neglect the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is filled with jewels and riches that are all designed to cast a spotlight more clearly onto the New Testament. Jesus Christ is more full and more beautiful and looks more victorious when you see him in the spotlight of the Old Testament.
Amen. Yes, amen.
So first century believers would study the Old Testament, the ins and outs, which is why when they read this letter that the Apostle Paul first wrote to them at Ephesus, they would have known something we don't always get. They would have known that in Isaiah 59, the prophet Isaiah painted a beautiful picture of the divine warrior Yahweh coming with a breastplate of righteousness on, coming with shoes of peace on his feet, coming with a helmet of salvation on his head. They would have known that these pieces of armor came straight from the divine warrior of the Old Testament. Why is this important? Because in the Old Testament, the reason why God needed to come in armor was in vengeance against his people because of our rebellion and our sin against him. So he came in vengeance against us. Now in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul writes this passage, the same pieces of armor that were used against us in the Old Testament, now under the new covenant of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, those same pieces of armor are given to us as a gift.
Yes, amen.
This is important because what it means is that the armor we have to push back against the darkness, to stand firm against the enemy, what it means is that this is not some second-hand, second-rate, hand-me-down armor here. If it was good enough for God, it sure was good enough for us. So the Apostle Paul says, let's start with truth. He says, if you want any hope of victory, in whatever area of your life right now, it's the biggest struggle. Honestly, it's the one that is eating your lunch. It's the one that is taking you for a ride. It's the one that keeps you up at night. It is the one that makes you wonder whether you want to keep doing this day after day. It is the one that when people email us, or sometimes I have the privilege to pray with people even out here in our home church, this is the one, that struggle that is so crippling to you that sometimes it even leads to thoughts of suicide or death being better than staying here in this mess that you're in. Paul says if you want any hope of victory in that place in your life where the enemy is stirring up so much trouble, you're wondering whether or not you're going to be able to make it. You've got to make a decision about this issue of truth. When you saw a Roman soldier, you could see his helmet because it would have these colorful feathers on top. You could see it. I could see it all the way clear from the back where I would know he was coming because of the color. I would also be able to see his huge shield. The shield was like a door, y'all. Huge planks of wood sealed together with an iron hub right in the middle. So big that 2 or 3 soldiers could get behind the shield at the exact same time if they were in a crouched position. When I first saw him, I'd see his helmet, or I would see that shield, maybe even the breastplate that was the largest piece of armor that they wore on their body. I'd see that first, or maybe I would even be able to see that broadsword. The broadsword was about 3 to 4 feet long, which, by the way, most of us think of when we think of the sword of the Spirit. But the sword of the Spirit was actually an 18-inch dagger that they also carried on their side. I would have seen all of these other things first, but when Paul was applying the spiritual principle of truth to one of the pieces of armor, he did not pick the impressive, he did not pick the noticeable, he did not pick the obvious. Underneath all of those pieces of armor that were more impressive and more applaudable, underneath it all was the belt. miraculous